Welcome to the BPA afternoon sessions for our annual conference, Brave New World. I'm delighted to say that our generous supporters, Conduent, are bringing us an interesting and fascinating information-packed afternoon lunchtime session for learning and lunching. You will hear from Dean Fennell-Connell, who is also a member of our council and various service boards, Jean-Marie Vial, Sharon Smith and Matt Darst, who has woken up at the crack of dawn from the US to be able to join us today. I welcome all four people and I hope all participants will enjoy this afternoon session. Please do post your experiences and any shared comments or views on our social media platforms right across the board. Two hashtags to use: Brave New World and BPA Virtual Conference. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Karen. Conduent Transportation are delighted to sponsor this event and to bring you all together to showcase some of the great expertise and knowledge that we have within our business, and also share with you some of the themes that we're seeing across the world, across multiple sectors that all have an impact on parking. So I'm going to hand over now to Jean-Marie Vial from our Automotive group to talk you through the future of automotive services.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dean, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm Jean-Marie Vial. I'm an automotive SME in European Sales Organization of Conduent, and I'm very pleased to share with you some thoughts about the future of automotive services. So, Dean, next slide, please. Thank you. A quick look on our agenda. Firstly, I would like to set the scene and have a look on the main trends of the automotive market description. Then took two interesting examples of automotive services, and then share a short conclusion with you. Let's have a look firstly on the automotive market description. As you know, the automotive car makers are facing a very brutal and very structural description called named Connected Autonomous Shared Electric Cars, CASE, as a short abbreviation. Based on the first challenge, the well-known CO2 emissions challenge in the European Union, bringing a second part of the challenge with mobility providers. The car makers are changing and moving to mobility providers, bringing the best user experience to their customers, and facing at the same time a very big challenge with new players entering the markets, like Tesla or EV Chinese car makers or other mobility makers, Uber and so on. Speaking about connected cars technology, I would like to focus 1 minute on the technology pyramid, because here we are talking of three stages indeed. The first one is about connectivity. Connectivity is enabled by the 5G connections, and outside of the discussions, the current discussion about 5G, about health, or about Chinese connections, I think one figure is quite interesting. By 2025, about 30% of the total connections should be 5G connections. It's a huge speed up coming from scratch in 5 years, meaning it will be a huge issue in the coming years. The second stage is about security based on blockchain technology. And on top of that, in order to manage the whole technology pyramid, we are used to see and to use the artificial intelligence part of the business. Just on the bottom of this slide, you can see just a very sum up of the six different parties the connected cars are supposed to communicate with. From vehicle to network, till vehicle to infrastructure, with vehicle to grid, and so on. This shows how big is the challenge. And I would like also to mention that it's in terms of market forecast, we are talking of a very concentrated market, because according to Capgemini survey, 50% of the connected cars ownership by 2023 will be concentrated in 3 markets: Germany, England, and France. Next slide, please. Thank you. But these connected cars are indeed a very big opportunity for the OEMs. In terms of sales drivers, as you can see here on a survey by Bearing Point, almost 60% of connected cars owners say that it will influence their choice of vehicle. In terms of royalty tool, it could be also very promising, because only 10% of active users plan to stop using this kind of connected services. It's a very promising result. And third, also insight, in terms of non-users, they are expecting themselves using this kind of connected services, for 20% of them for navigation and 6% of convenience. And especially in the parking business, combining navigation and convenience could be a very promising market. That's why, all in all, in terms of revenue, in terms of pricing, in terms of customer direct relationship, it's a very interesting opportunity for the OEM. Next slide, please. Well, in terms of consequences of this major trend, I prepare here a very short press review about some interesting highlights. Let's take, for instance, the self-driving valet parking. We will have a deeper overview on that topic just a minute later. Interesting topic also from ZF, the famous automotive supplier, using the car as an e-wallet based on blockchain technology in order to pay for charging, fueling, tolling, parking, and more. And the question is not to know if the 100% of the passenger cars market will be connected cars or not by 2026, but as mentioned by this quotation, if the people will definitely use them and what for. And I think it's a very important question, because we are at the very early stage of this promising market. Next slide, please. Okay, let's have a look now on one first case study, the automated valet parking by Ford and Bosch as a test in Detroit. And let's start by a short video to have a view on how it works. Yeah, it's a very promising and exciting service, parking service. But on the other hand, in terms of business models, there is some very opening questions to be answered. For instance, in terms of infrastructure cost, in terms of type of building, is it an in-house solution only? What about kerbside, for instance? What about the number of locations? About the market size? About the pricing, meaning customer value? Are we talking of premium services or of confined value creation? To bring another insight, as you can see here on the bottom of the slide, it's an interesting point coming from a survey by Capgemini about the best B2B services to be monetized. And according to this survey, the two best services that can be a revenue growth opportunity are predictive maintenance and fleet management. And as we can see also on the bottom, location-based service are not supposed to be a very strong opportunity, which means there are a couple of topics that are quite well known in terms of predictive maintenance, fleet management, because fleet management, we are not starting from today. It's a long story, and now combining with telematics. But there are some very unknown territories in terms of business models. Next slide, please. Okay, second example I would like to use today is a travel assistant. Of course, it's a very busy slide, but the idea is not to go too deep into details, as you can understand, but it's just to sum up what this travel assistant plan is meaning. Indeed, the customers' queries right now are not 100% managed by the OEM, but are divided into different silos. For instance, you can have an OEM like BMW or Mercedes bringing some connected services about navigation, about predictable parking slots situation, and so on. But as far as we can see as of today, there are not a single OEM covering the full spectrum of all the customer queries. What is missing is a customer interaction layer covering the end-to-end seamless journey. I put a couple of examples as third-party service providers. What is about parking slot queries, about charging slots, about all kinds of mobilities, car sharing, car hailing, transit, and so on. Or what about the digital automotive journey, workshop appointment, test drive, all other queries coming from the customer to his OEM. And indeed, we are talking of data compiling, of payment solution, all in one single application or connected vehicle. Here, of course, we are talking between OEM and third-party service providers of increasing revenue based on data monetization. Next slide, please, Dean. Thank you. Just as a short conclusion, indeed, connected services age has just begun. We are at the very beginning, meaning, as we discussed previously, there are some opening points in terms of business models, in terms of cost, in terms of data monetization between OEM, cities, third-party service providers. And here, bear in mind also the smart cities issue, because at the end of the day, all these different topics are mixing themselves. Second point is about the V2X part of the connected car. By now, the OEMs are more car-centric, and they need progressively to offer additional services to connected to the grid, to the network, to the city. Third point is a real challenge: vehicle versus smartphone, because as we saw previously, in terms of customer interaction layer, are we used to put it into a smartphone application, or to use it through the vehicle, or with a combined solution, meaning CarPlay or mirroring. It's a real question because more and more customers are used to use for all these kind of additional services their application, and it's a real challenge for the OEM to convince their customer to use more and more the connected services from the car itself. And I'm convinced that we will indeed find a mixed way, because without living and offering additional services, without an application, without the smartphone, it's a no way. But on the other hand, you have to use all what a connected car can offer. It can be a huge number of additional services. And of course, service and mobility, as I mentioned, at the end of the day, connected services, mobility, here we are landing to the mass territory, to the mobility as a service. And as you understood, it's a real opportunity for the OEM in terms of revenue increasing and loyalty, because of an increasing demand from the customer, which means an interesting customer value perception as part of the seamless automotive journey, and giving the fact that these technologies are available or are coming in the very coming months and years. And as a last figure, I would like to underline a very interesting forecast by KPMG about the mass penetration in the new vehicle market in the UK of about 40% of the market in 2040, which means how big is this challenge. Thank you very much for your attention. And now I will take over to Sharon Smith for our second topic of the afternoon. Have a nice afternoon. Bye.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Great to meet you virtually. And it's great to discuss this topic of customer communications and experience management. It is an interesting topic of customer expectations and the sometimes dreaded parking experience. As someone who's been driving literally every day for the last 28 years, I find it really interesting speaking to people of different ages who question my desire to drive everywhere that I can. They're always saying, you know, parking will be a nightmare. You'll never find parking. I never know the parking rules. It's easier to take an Uber or transport. So hopefully we can use today to start discussions around how we can improve that parking experience for everybody. Next slide, please. It's a fascinating situation where customers are actually driving businesses to invest in new technologies to ensure their experiences meet their expectations. This means adding a complete new service, for example, social media payments, or allowing the connected experience parking through geofencing, for example. We're basically living in a world We're basically living in a world where everything must be immediate because we're all in a rush nowadays. We expect seamless and trouble-free experiences, and specifically to parking, we just want to be able to pay easily, multiple ways, whether it's cash, card, or through the app. And obviously we can look at tiered pricing if people wanted to pay through cash. It's a more expensive experience. We also want a clear understanding of how much it is to pay to park there, and if we can actually park there. A good example was yesterday I was at the gym. I pulled up and parked where I usually do, went to the app, paid for my parking, and when I came out there was a ticket on my car because the parking bay had been suspended. But at no point during that parking experience did the app or anyone explain that to me, and there definitely was no clear signs. So there's a dilemma, is the crossover between customer expectations and their parking experience. Next slide, please. So let's look at some stats. We all know that every journey starts in a parking space and ends in a parking space. So it's clear the ability to move from A to B seamlessly and stress-free is essential. Parking is basically seen as a very stressful experience for the majority of drivers, although a lot of them are satisfied if the information is clearly displayed. There's still a large percentage of people who still want to speak to a human at some point during that parking experience. So these are just a few stats to prove that the expectation of hassle-free, clear experience with the connectivity to an agent is actually needed. Next slide, please. So 3 experience areas I have identified to focus on is agent knowledge, multi-channel payments, and predictive services. So if we take agent knowledge, it's essential that if someone does have to call one of your agents, that they're available to support and guide them through their parking journey. Agents must have knowledge of parking restrictions, geographies, what's happening in that particular area, specifically to tariffs and any major events. So a clear knowledge base is in real time is essential for your agents. Multi-channel payments. I know that there's times when I've gone and the machine needs cash and I just don't have cash. So, or opposite, I have cash and it wants card, or I can only pay through the app. I think it's really good if we're able to offer customers multi-channel payment options and tier them if needed. Have, cash is the most expensive, so £2 an hour for cash, £1.50 an hour for card, £1 through the app, but then also introduce new payment options like PayPal or social media. And also, if there's any issues, that easy ability to connect to an agent if needed. There's an option to also look at AR services on the payment systems, where customers can hold their phone up and it will direct them straight to an agent. Predictive services, looking at real-time parking information. So the ability for me to be driving into central London and understand where those parking locations are free. The ability to put into Waze or any navigation system where I'm going, and to have a two-way communication as parking becomes available based on my payment preference. So if I have cash, it will identify cash locations for me. Basically easy navigation to parking spaces, very clear tariffs, payment options, map updates, and basically giving your customers the ability to plan their journey ahead of time and have a seamless experience. Next slide, please. So basically, Conduent has a range of platforms that are designed to improve experiences, all integrated for that omni-channel nirvana. Next, if you just press click, the option to have a platform layer above all parking platforms enables one location for the customer, regardless of who owns the parking space. Do you want to press the couple clicks, Dean? Thank you. So that's a Conduent platform. And regardless of who's actually owning that parking space, the customer should have the same seamless experience of being able to pay for their parking. Next slide, please. So basically, transaction processing, the department I work in Conduent, we help businesses transform their processes, focusing on end user experiences through automation. We also support other areas such as inbound scanning of communications, extracting that data, pushing it internally to your organisation for processing. But we can also offer payment and management support, all supported by AI, analytics, automation. Just press a click for me. So that piece under customer communications is where I've been focusing on today. The ability to offer your parking customers multi-channel communications, communication management, interactive engagement technology, and that overall customer experience platform. Next slide, please.
What if the future of business services isn't centered on business at all? What if it's centered on us? Digital experiences built around us that make us more productive, efficient, and loyal as employees, as customers, as patients, as members. Business leaders are rethinking approaches to service design and delivery. Instead of engineering the business process from the inside out, we're starting with the human being and working our way from the outside in. so we can recognize and acknowledge each individual in the moment based on a 360-degree view across all interactions. So we build experiences that reflect the technology diversity of the multiple generations that we serve. Digital experiences that are consistent across all channels and can happen from a desk, a taxi, an airport, from home. Interactions that get smarter from one to the next and continually optimize based on learning from interaction to interaction. That prove we are listening when we are getting feedback and can respond accordingly. New digital technologies are enabling more intuitive interactions across all facets of business services. Mobile, blockchain, machine learning, automation, cognitive, and the Internet of Things. Which ones are most strategic for my business? How can they enable experiences that not only satisfy, but anticipate what's next? Conduent, anticipating every opportunity.
That was just a video giving you an overview of customer experience and the importance of it. That was a really short clip of what I do and how we can potentially work together in the parking space. So I'd like to thank you all for listening and welcome any questions now, or please feel free to reach out to Dean or myself if you'd like to potentially have a roundtable discussion about the art of the possible of parking and customer communications. I'll now pass over to Matt.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you to BPA for allowing me to speak today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about using analytics to repurpose the curb. And more, we're seeing municipalities embrace data-driven decision-making. You really only need two things to do that. One is access to data, and the second is data scientists, preferably data scientists with advanced degrees in machine learning or electrical engineering and data science, and training in computer vision and AI. And combined, these things can help cities implement informed policies. And while my team has made dozens of recommendations to clients to improve the use of the curb using analytics, there are really three areas that I want to focus on. If we could move to the next slide, Dean. One is how can we gather curbside data using lean asset models? So how can we gather this data cheaper? Second is how do we take that data and use it to inform demand management policies, specifically demand pricing? And third, can we take that data and also use it to optimize the use of the curb? Is a space where we have a meter better used for another purpose? Is there a loading zone that no longer fits the bill for that particular area? And I'll show you some examples of some work that's been done in that space as well. Next slide. There was a time when cities thought that a sensor needed to be installed in every space to understand parking. And we know now that we can employ spatial and temporal sampling, or sampling by time and by location, to determine curb use. Los Angeles implemented 6,800 sensors a few years ago as part of its demand pricing program to understand parking patterns. And that abundance of data allowed us to model a number of different concepts, like what happens if sensors are missing, or what happens if you have fewer observations. And what we found was you could have 50% sensor coverage and very closely equate to the accuracy of 100% sensor coverage. We also found that different incremental views could provide a similar view. So 17 days of minute-by-minute observations almost equated to 100% coverage, as well as 3 weeks of 5-day observations. And we also found that Tobler's law, which is represented in the bottom right-hand side, held true, and that is that close things, in this case neighboring parking spaces, act more similarly than far things or parking spaces that may be across town. So we'll move to the next slide and we'll talk about Park DC. This was the first big test of asset light implementation. This in particular is the Penn Quarter Chinatown neighborhood, and we tested our theory that we could take or use less data to make predictions and with little in the way of errors. Here we had 450 sensors deployed over 1,000 parking spaces. The blue spaces indicate spaces without a sensor. We also employed an algorithm to optimize the allocation of the communications infrastructure to reduce that cost, the gateway cost, if you will, by 15%. Next slide. I wish it was as easy, though, as just saying, let's put a sensor in every other space. Or every third space. Unfortunately, it's not. The sensors have to be installed in the right spaces in order to provide the most accurate prediction of occupancy. What you see up in the upper right-hand side is a representation of different blocks and how each one of these elements on the x-axis represents a space, and you can see utilization going up and down in different spaces across the curb. So we know that curb use is inefficient. So when we choose the sensors to be placed on, when we choose the spaces to be censored, we need to choose the right spaces. So here you see a couple of examples in the middle where we had one block that had 19 spaces where we found if we picked the 4 right sensors, we could approximate occupancy across the whole block. Below that, you see another location that had 6 spaces, and we found that if we picked 2 of them, we could get the right average occupancy. What we also found, and this is represented by the algorithmic expression on the bottom left, is that as a block, larger blocks need fewer sensors as a percentage, whereas smaller blocks need a larger number of sensors as a percentage. So these are ideas that kind of shape our data collection. Next slide. If you place the sensors in the right way, they really do give you, and this is an expression of sensor placement on several blocks in DC. They will provide you with good information about occupancy, the average length of stay, and turnover. Next slide. But more and more, we're seeing cameras and computer vision become commoditized, and that really provides some great opportunities for data gathering, especially in a cheaper way. So as I noted, we can gather data using cameras by space or by block. Those are represented by the top 2 images on the right. But cameras provide you more information, especially in undemarcated parking environments. They provide information not just about the length of the vehicle that's parked, as you see in the bottom middle image, but also the distances between vehicles that are parked. And if you look at the bottom image on the right, you'll see the blue spaces in between. Those are unutilized portions of the curb during a given day. And so cameras can really help us determine how efficient parking is on a curb. And there are other benefits, as I'll talk about on the next slide. Specifically, they can help provide information about pedestrian counts, bicycles, other modes of transportation. They can also deliver information about double parking or TNC use. Next slide. What I'm really excited about, and an area we've been working in recently, is ANPR data as a proxy for parking data or sensor data. And here you see two maps. One represents the occupancy on blocks based on ANPR data that's been captured by vehicle-mounted cameras. And on the right-hand side, you see a measure of passes. So one, we can document the occupancy, but we can also determine how accurate it might be by the number of passes in a particular area and the days and times of those passes. This also gives us some clues about where we might need to gather additional data. Next slide. So when we take all this together, we can create a factor, if you will, by comparing this to paid use. Our DC client likes to refer to this approach as the data blender approach, and I think that's a good way of looking at it. Utilizing things like PCNs, which equate to an unpaid parking event, we can improve accuracy even more. In this case, we've got a root mean square error of between 5 and 7% across the entire pilot area in the district, which is pretty good. And so the red line is the actual average occupancy, while the purple line is the predicted occupancy, simply based on adding citations and this factor that we created from these other spatial and temporal sampling methodologies back to paid use. Next slide. We're continuing to think of ways that we can make make capturing data cheaper. I've found that there are some interesting trends post COVID-19. You'll see that on the left-hand side, this represents average occupancy in an area for a client city, and you see how it just falls at the beginning of the pandemic and it's beginning to climb. We're finding though that climb, and we can predict, I think, when we'll reach occupancy, the average occupancy again that we once had obtained based on the graphic that's in the lower right. But what we're finding is that occupancy isn't returning at the same pace across every block. And in fact, that utilization of those blocks is driven by the types of businesses on that block. And so in areas where we have large dining halls or amusements, movie theaters, we're finding that occupancy is still lagging pre-COVID volumes. I think there's some real opportunities there to rethink how those curb spaces are being used in order to optimize the curb. Can they be used for loading? Can they be used for TNCs? Can they be used for non-traditional purposes that may help communities? Next slide. And I want to talk a little bit about demand pricing and the DC and LA case studies in that regard. So in DC, the pilot area started with a single rate, an hourly rate structure across all spaces of $2.30. We have iteratively made pricing recommendations to the client and now have 11 different pricing structures in place across different segments of the day. We'll go to the next slide now. Just explain my thoughts on demand pricing a little bit. I think everyone's probably very familiar with the traditional model. It's usually quantified as something like you need to always have a space available on a block, and that often is considered 10 to 15% parking availability. And so often cities will say, well, if I hit an average of 85%, then I'm doing right, and if I'm going above that, I need to increase rates. I personally think that methodology of using averages has some potential problems. It could very well be that 85% represents an even distribution of demand by every minute of the day, but typically it doesn't. And so I want to use this case study to talk about a more nuanced approach. So here we've got a block that's used 70% of the time, 50%, it's used 70% of the time, 50% of an hour, or for 30 minutes of an hour, and then 100% of the time during the remaining hours. And I take that back. It's 70% of the time during 25 minutes and 0% for 5 minutes. So that gives you an average of 79% use. So you might look at that and say, hey, that's pretty good. 79% is well below 85. But when you start thinking about the block being half full, let me rephrase this. A disproportionate number of parkers are being impacted during 50% of that hour. So if you assume that just one additional parker is being impacted at that point, that number increases incrementally. So if half as many motorists are cruising for parking during that peak, it's really 72% of potential customers are being impacted by the inability to find a parking space. So what we suggest is taking the fraction of really high use, or use over 90%, and reducing or subtracting from that the percentage of low use, so the use below 70%, to determine whether or not the rate should increase or be reduced. In this case, if we took the fraction of high percent of use, which is 50%, and the fraction of low use, which is 0%, that the difference would be greater than 33%. So we'd actually be saying in this case, as we did in DC, let's increase the rates. And there are a number of other considerations to account for too. How frequently are you going to change the rates? What type of increments are you going to use? What are the appropriate time bands? How should time limits be applied? And what are the maximum stays at those parking spaces? And I'd be happy to go into the details of some of that offline. We have some material we can distribute in that regard. Next slide. So these are some of the results. I'm going to focus more on DC since it's more recent. The DC, I think the pilot was very successful. We saw a 6-minute reduction in average stays from 66 minutes to 60 minutes. We saw a 10 to 15% reduction in circling for parking, a 5% increase in availability, a 55% reduction in double parking, and a 17% increase in revenue. So this project very much self-funded itself. And then from a convenience perspective, we found that the time to find a parking space fell between 3 and 5 minutes. And that was based on both camera studies as well as surveys with commuters. In LA, I just want to note something that I thought was really neat. We found that the number of cheaper spaces within one block of someone's destination increased from 40% to 90%. So in Los Angeles, the balance of spaces had a reduced rate, but revenue still increased by 2% as part of that pilot. or that project, I should say. Next slide. So now that we understand the use of the curb and we understand how we can impact demand, I want to talk a little bit about the potential to optimize the curb. And this represents some client data, publicly available client data that we access to discern the location of loading zones. And that's all the way on the left-hand side. And we compared those loading zones to all the businesses and their addresses. And so in the middle graphic, the larger points all represent areas where there are more businesses being served by a loading zone. And the smaller dots represent businesses that are not served by loading zones. And so then on the right-hand side, this is a heat map that indicates where there's a higher ratio of businesses to loading zones. And it could be indicative of loading zone deserts, if you will. And so having this data, as well as data concerning occupancy and utilization of the public way, we can apply machine learning and determine the potential for repurposing, removing or adding loading zones, as we'll see on the next slide. So this is, as I said, what we did was we took things like the number of double parking and meter violations that were being issued, fire hydrant parking, the occupancy of loading zones, meter payments, meter utilization, and we pulled these things together to study all the different loading zones. So in this case, you see that there are two loading zones indicated by stars. The first loading zone barely gets utilized, the one in blue. The chart immediately below the image shows the utilization of that loading zone, and it only approaches 50% at about 7 p.m. The other loading zone is used very differently. It has high occupancy almost all the way through the day, often getting close to 100%. So the call to action here, we believe, is there are a couple different courses. You could reduce the operable hours of the loading zone on the left from 6 to 8 p.m. and make that metered parking during other hours. The meters are in very high demand in this neighborhood, and so that would provide some congestion relief. Or we could reduce the size of that loading zone. It's a fairly large loading zone. We could reduce it to maybe half that size. Or we could move it around the corner where there just happen to be several other restaurants located that could benefit from the use of this loading zone. Next slide. And then these are two other ideas. Keep an existing loading zone or add a loading zone. So in the case on the left-hand side, we found that there is a loading zone in this location that's 56 feet long. There are lots of businesses, 18 businesses served by that loading zone. 9 of them are restaurants based on the data that we obtained. And the average occupancy on the neighboring streets is very high. So this is a loading zone that's highly utilized and really necessary to the businesses in this area in order to make deliveries. The right-hand side represents an area where we probably should think about adding a loading zone. This is a block that has 21 metered spaces. The utilization is greater than 90%. There's lots of double parking, illegal double parking, lots of meter violations. We know from ANPR data, there are lots of people parking at the fire hydrants here as well, because there's just no place to park short-term for quick loading and unloading. So this might be an area where we would suggest adding a loading zone. And that concludes my discussion. I do appreciate your time and consideration today.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Sharon and Jean-Marie. I think it's been, the point of this Lunch and Learn really was just to share with everyone the wide expertise that we have available to us as within Conduent, but also as an industry. Matt's done a lot of work with Parking News and written articles, and has a lot of thought leadership that isn't just for Conduent and Conduent clients. It's for our industry to continue to move forward, and something that we're keen to promote and share with everyone. But I wasn't expecting us to have a few minutes, but Karen, Bex, if we want to, if there's a couple of questions that you guys have got that you think we can cover in that time, I think we've got a bit of time to cover that.
Hi Dean, it's Bex here. We haven't had any questions come through, so if anyone in the audience has got a question, excuse me, for the panel, please do submit it via the Q&A question. If it's something that the panel needs to take away and obviously take some time to think about and respond, they can equally do that. So yeah, but other than that, Dean, I'm very happy for you to wrap things up.
Okay, yeah, no problem. So yeah, I want to firstly thank everyone for taking their time and sitting listening to us while having your sandwich.
Oh, we've got Graham. Graham Titchener's just come through with a question. Thanks, Graham. Can we use existing CCTV and some sort of software to cover curbside? Who do you feel?
So yeah, Matt, are you happy to answer that in terms of experience we've had in other projects?
Yeah, absolutely. And the answer, Graham, is yes. You can apply computer vision to existing video to gather a lot of that data. Of course, the devil's always in the details. The angling and height of the cameras is a factor, but that's something that we're seeing more and more in the industry.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Graham, one of the images there in the presentation, the other benefits slide in the top left, it was talking about it was showing percentage accuracy of the object that was seen. That was actually taken through when we first started looking at this at Conduent and in the UK through a and I'm not scared to publicly announce it. I bought a £20 dash cam from Asda and sent the footage to Matt and his team to run that. So if we can do it with a £20 dash cam, I'm sure the CCTV infrastructure that we've all got in place in the UK is going to be better than that. I think the other thing to add is that this isn't just stuff, and I think we all get hooked up in terms of our own supplier base. Well, if I'm a Conduent client, I can't access information that another provider might be able to. If I'm a non-Conduent client, I can't access Matt and his team or anyone within Conduent to support me. Ultimately, as Matt stated at the beginning of his presentation, it's just data, and as long as we can get access to that data, or another supplier that's providing a similar service can get access to that data, it doesn't need to be your sole supplier, and it plays into what we spoke about this morning in terms of partnerships. I think the only way we can all achieve greatness is by working together, and that's also the crossover of suppliers working together as well.
Thank you, Dean. It is Karen here. I was trying to be very, very soft touch on this one because I've done a lot of talking throughout a lot of sessions. We do have a question here from Peter Lowe, and I think it's a really important one. If the legislation allowed us to change curbside restrictions automatically and immediately in the future to match demand, is that something you would ideally have dovetail into? It's dynamic usage, not dynamic charging. Is that?
Yeah. So I think, Matt, I'll start it off, but if you can tie it into your work, it comes down to segmentation of it can be based on both price but also on usage. But Matt's the expert in that, so I'm not going to take too much of anyone's time to cover my thoughts. So Matt, if you can add to that.
Sure. No, I think that's accurate. We're seeing a push right now towards dynamic curbside policies, which would allow those policies on the curb to change throughout the day. So you might have different pricing for different types of uses, to your point, segmented areas of a particular street or curbside face. I think every city that we've worked with has dealt initially with the challenges, the legislative challenges of how do you do this? And we have found there are some ways that you can implement legislation that make the electorate a little happier. For instance, one thing that we typically see clients do is they put brackets on the very highest price point and the very lowest price point based on a particular use. And should they need to increase the price above that threshold, then they need to revisit their council and get them to approve it via vote.
Do you know what, Dean, can I jump in? We've only got a couple of minutes literally till we have to end this session. We've got to dive straight back in from an organisational perspective until our afternoon EV session. But it's something that's really struck me, particularly as we started the conversation some months ago with Brett, which I mentioned earlier. It's not just about dealing with a pandemic, is it, that we need to get joined up solutions and we need to learn from each other, whatever continent or country or border that we are defined by or located in. One size does not fit all in this country, in England alone, never mind with the UK. And we've seen such a difference in response to the pandemic and different rules and regulations. If the parking sector are going to learn anything coming out of this, because we've shown ourselves to be a dynamic sector, do you think there's much more that we can learn from not a one size fits all in terms of our parking solutions and our approach to parking management, but that we need to be reaching out more broadly to our continental cousins and our friends across the pond? Do you think that's the way? Do you really think that better collaboration is going to stand us in far stronger position to deal with what's coming?
Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately, we're all trying to deal with the same thing. We're trying to deal with someone who kind of leaves their front door, gets in their car, and then tries to park it somewhere different. And that doesn't matter whether you're in Paris with Jean-Marie, in Chicago with Matt, or in London with Sharon. It's the same common problem is the one that we're all trying to solve. And only by working together are we going to be able to overcome that.
And Jean, Matt, Sharon, just any sort of final words from you on that? Do you think we've got it pretty good so far, or do you think there's still a way to go?
I think we're heading in the right direction. I'm a big advocate for data transparency, and I think if you put that data out there for the public to consume, then the right decisions will be made from it.
Yeah, and just final, before we've got a couple of seconds left, I think, the world's ever changing, and I think, the parking world has to be in line with the rest of the world and, keep up with people's requirements and expectations, which are growing.
Yes, absolutely. I think that we are moving regarding your parking business. We are moving from, let's say, more or less fixed building to a connected building. And it's a major change and challenge for the coming years between all what Matthew just described in terms of data management and dynamic pricing, for instance, and the connected cars I mentioned previously.
Well, there you go. You've just given me the material to round up. So we've got to move from a fixed mindset to a more dynamic mindset. And I think the world has shown that we can do that. I think this session has shown we can do that. Thank you so much. Jean-Marie, Sharon, Matt, Dean Van O'Connell, once again, what a wonderful session. Thank you so much. You've given our audience plenty to think about And we will again make this this session, and any questions or thoughts that come through or comments, we'll make sure that they get to you